We're now ready to look at John chapter 2. And before we do so, we want to, of course, start with a little outline indicating how John breaks it down. John chapter 2 is relatively simple. In verses 1 to 11, we have the account of the wedding at Cana. Verse 12 serves as a transition from Cana of Galilee to Capernaum. And then in verses 13 through 22, we have the temple scene in Jerusalem at Passover, followed by verses 23 and 25, which focus the summary of events that Jesus did in Jerusalem, although they are not narrated specifically for us, all that he was doing. John chapter 2 has some themes that we want to pay attention to before we get to talk about the wedding of Cana. One of the things we find as we enter John chapter 2 is a sense of inclusion. Inclusion is when there are two very similar stories that draw attention to themselves and form as a parenthesis around what's encapsulated. And so in John chapter 2, at the wedding of Cana, we say this is the first of his signs, this is Cana. And then at the end of John chapter 4, there is the second miracle or sign, and it's recorded as the second sign which did Cana. And so obviously here we have parentheses such that chapter 2, 3, and 4 should be read as a unit to a degree, and everything inside contained with the concept of this miracle power that demonstrates who he is. But the inclusion does not limit itself to John chapter 2. We actually find that between John chapter 2 and John chapter 11, with the story of Lazarus, the ideas of glory and belief shape a section. So the resurrection that happens with Lazarus in chapter 11 is somehow tied to the wedding of Cana in chapter 2. And then Jesus responds to his mother that it's not yet my hour. In John chapter 2 and in chapter 13, he realizes that his hour is not come. So the hour shapes that. And so chapter 2 to 13 read in light of Jesus' hour and all of that. And so inclusion is one thing that we have to pay attention to as we're reading through the Gospel of John. Inclusions are oftentimes interwoven so that one starts, then the second one starts, then one, then the second. That is the interlocking storytelling about John. The second thing that we want to pay attention to is chronology. John chapter 2 opens with a phrase, on the third day, which makes you wonder where the day had been talked about before. And what we find is that after the prologue, so beginning in verse 19, we have this testimony of John. So this serves as the first day. John gives testimony. He talks about a few different sayings. And then in verse 29, he has the next day, the day to the tooth. And this is when he declares Jesus to be the Lamb of God. And then in John chapter 35, the next day, he again said Jesus is the Lamb of God, and two disciples start to follow. They then find Peter, and the three of them in that evening. So in verse 43, we now have the next day. So we have John 1:19, which is the first day. Then we have John 29, which is the second day, and John 35, which is the third day, John 43, which is the fourth day, and then 5, 6, 7 makes on the third day. And so John is using this imagery to say this is a little bit like creation. A new creation is taking place. A new sphere is opening for human existence and is being compared to Genesis. We know from our talk about the prologue that the prologue in the first words in the beginning draws attention to the creation incarnation story. The other thing that's very interesting is that the phrase on the third day is a phrasing in Greek that says the day, the third. This language, literally, the day, the third, only appears 3 times in the New Testament. Once is in Luke 18:33, when Jesus is forecasting his suffering. Here in John chapter 2, verse 1, and then in 1 Corinthians 15, verse 4, which is part of the Kerygma, in which it says, Paul is writing to the Corinthians, says, I received, and I passed on to you that which I received, that Christ died for our sins according to the scriptures, that he was buried, and that he was raised on the day the third. And so there is a sense of using that language. Now, this the day the third that is tying this entire section of Cana into the resurrection of Jesus, this resurrection life. That's a very important element. The final thing that we want to look at in our presentation is the theme of glory. We find at the end of the story of Cana, the wedding of Cana, that the disciples believed because Jesus had manifested or revealed his glory to them in the sign. So this miracle reveals his glory. And so as we see more miracles happening, literally the signs that are happening, they are revelations of the glory of Jesus. And we know from our discussion of the prologue that the glory, what is the scene when the word becomes flesh, when the incarnation takes place. We also see glory talked about in chapter 11 with the story of Lazarus, and then also in chapter 12 when the voice from heaven speaks in reference to Jesus' prayer. And so these themes of inclusion, of the counting of time and shaping the story, and then also carrying this theme of glory forward, is important for understanding what the evangelist is trying to communicate. We get these clues as we go along the story, and then eventually we go, oh, we know what it's about. We know what's happening. And the story is designed, the gospel is designed to help us find those clues if we simply are listening to what is being taken. So with that, we'll close this section so it doesn't get too long, and then we'll pick up with the wedding and some details about that in our next particular video. So thank you.